Good afternoon. I am Ethan Potter, a recent International Development graduate, and I would like to welcome you to the January Series 2017. I would also like to extend a special welcome to three of our 50 remote webcast sites: Ripon, California, Sioux Center, Iowa, and Holland, Michigan. Now, if you will please pray with me. God our Father, you love justice and have called us to pursue it in this world in your name. Please grant us the strength to work on your behalf. Thank you for your mercy and your grace, and thank you for the work of your servant, Gary Haugen. Please bless him as he speaks to us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, Kevin Dundalk, director of the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, will introduce our guest.
We might be compelled by the cries of vulnerable people across the globe, people who live with violence and yearn for justice. But how do we answer those cries? Gary Haugen has committed his life to answering that question. After degrees from Harvard and the University of Chicago in the 1980s, Gary began his work as a human rights attorney, most notably for the U.S. Department of Justice, and in 1994 as the director of the United Nations investigation of the Rwandan genocide. These and other experiences showed him the real costs of everyday violence, of sex trafficking, illegal property grabbing, police abuse, violation of citizen rights, modern-day slavery. But these experiences also showed him opportunities to work through justice systems, even systems that were complicit in violence, to rescue and restore victims. That's the purpose of the International Justice Mission, which Gary founded in 1997. Through field offices across the world, IJM partners with local advocates to use the basic mechanisms of policing and courts on behalf of the most vulnerable. And in fact, I think we have a picture. If we call that up, we'll see if it comes up in a second. There it is. This is a picture taken this morning. I think in our neck of the woods, we call this providential timing. But this picture was taken of a group of Calvin students who are on an interim class on leadership in Africa. And this is the Nairobi, Kenya field office. And we're just very happy to be able to see Calvin joining together with IJM on this day in Kenya. Through field offices like this one across the world, the use of policing and courts has not only brought relief to thousands of people, but it's also brought reform to justice systems themselves. And Gary's transformative efforts through IJM have resulted in honors and accolades from high places. But the work is really rooted in humble convictions, a Christian vision of helping the least of these. Gary has laid out that vision in several books, including Good News About Injustice, and most recently, The Locust Effect, Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. It's a vision we try to foster at Calvin's Henry Institute, and so we're pleased to help support Gary's visit today. Calvin College is also grateful to Barnes & Thornburg for underwriting today's presentation. Please welcome Gary Haugen.
Well, good afternoon. It is a great joy to finally be here at Calvin, to have this opportunity to share the day with you. This is an extraordinary privilege for me to be part of this truly extraordinary lecture series at a truly extraordinary college. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it today. Thank you for all the effort and resources that have been brought to bear to make this day possible. And thank you for attending. And thank you to all those who are joining online for this lecture today. I want to begin by asking if you can remember from your earliest days when you were given the great dignity of responsibility. I can remember this very vividly myself because I was 8 years old and I was in Tacoma, Washington on vacation with my family, visiting my Uncle Chuck and Aunt Phyllis. Now, Uncle Chuck was an old school construction worker, and he had the height and girth and mobility of a vending machine. And Uncle Chuck was my favorite uncle for two reasons: because he was funny and because he would let me watch TV. And there was one night we had stayed up way past my bedtime watching Gunsmoke. And then Uncle Chuck asked me if I would be willing to come help him at work the next morning. Needless to say, this was pretty much like Neil Armstrong asking if I would help with the Apollo mission to the moon. This was serious. This was the big time. And I was needed. We'd probably have to wake up before sunup and drink coffee. And indeed, the next morning, my little 8-year-old self did both things. It was an epic, sweaty day. I handed Uncle Chuck heavy tools. I swept mountains of sawdust and trash. I drank from a thermos. And at the end of the day, I loaded up the truck, pretty much by myself. And I clambered up to ride shotgun on the drive home. And while I couldn't quite see over the dashboard, I did casually rest my arm out the open truck window like any working man does on his ride home after a tough day. That summer, I had arrived at Uncle Chuck's 3'10", but I returned to my home 7 feet tall. Because Uncle Chuck had given me the dignity of responsibility. He gave me grown-up work to do, a sense of significance to my little being, the joy of getting to make a difference. This is, of course, the great joy that God, our Heavenly Father, invites us into as He bestows upon His children the dignity of responsibility, as He gives us work to do in the world. In fact, think about just about everything that God wants done in the world. We know two things about everything He wants done in the world. He wants His gospel to be known. He wants the sick to be healed. He wants the hungry to be fed. He wants families whole. He wants justice to be done. But the two things that we can know about all these things are, number one, He could do them all by Himself. But secondly, He chooses instead to use people to get His work done in the world. Now, we might argue with God that this is perhaps the most inefficient plan possible for getting things done, and we would probably be right. But God, in His sovereignty, has chosen to grant us the dignity of responsibility. Now, God maintains ultimate responsibility for the work, as my Uncle Chuck did at the construction site. But nevertheless, God has decided to place into our hands responsibility for accomplishing the things that He is passionate about. To share the good news, to love the lonely, to raise children, to protect the vulnerable, to paint the masterpiece, to tell the truth, to plant the seed, to order the chaos. You and I get to do these things. And occasionally there are singular generations that are given stewardship over a unique moment in history. A first century church generation that turned the world upside down with a gospel of love. Or a 16th century church generation that charted a reformation out of corruption and empty religion. An 18th century fellowship of founding fathers who pioneered new forms of democracy and rule of law. What they refer to as the greatest generation that fought and defeated the genocidal violence of 20th century fascism. or a civil rights generation that marched singing out of churches to defeat systems of legalized racism, or what we might call a generous generation that confronted the scourge of HIV/AIDS and actually was able to reverse the path of a global pandemic. What a great dignity for the people of God to be given a role to play in such epic struggles of divine consequence. And so this afternoon, I would like us to pause and consider the utterly unique moment in history which God seems to have placed before us. Because whether we know it or not, Almighty God has ordained for us to be alive in a unique time in His ancient struggle against the most iconic manifestation of evil in the human story. And that is the struggle against slavery. Very few people are aware of this, but there are actually more people in slavery today than in any other time in human history. There are almost 46 million people held illegally in slavery in our world today. That is 4 times the number of slaves that were extracted from Africa during 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade. Right now, the human slavery is a $150 billion business. It generates more profits than Coca-Cola, Disney, General Electric, IBM, Chevron, Wells Fargo Bank, and ExxonMobil combined. Slavery is not a relic of history. It's a larger reality than at any other time before. So if our mental image of slavery is a black and white photo from the 19th century, we really do need to update it with color for the millions of 21st century slaves laboring, for instance, on agricultural facilities around the world. Or if this is the picture of slavery in our minds, it needs to reflect the millions of slaves trapped by violence in brick factories today. The horrors and degradations of slavery that we perhaps learned about as children continue on an even more vast scale today. And of course, children who in other eras found themselves born into slavery today likewise find themselves inheriting the yoke of slavery by the millions, as the old violence and humiliation of slavery takes on 21st century forms. Now, if these realities of modern day slavery seem shocking and surreal and maybe just unbelievable to you, I know exactly the way it is that you feel, because I can remember when I first met an actual slave. It was nearly 20 years ago now. It was a tiny little 10-year-old girl named Shama, who was just a few years older than my own daughters, who was forced to sit on one place on the floor 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, rolling cigarettes, only to wake up to have to do that over and over and over again. Or the time I was conducting an undercover investigation into child sex trafficking in Southeast Asia and found myself in the back room of a brothel with a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age who were being sold to foreign pedophiles and sex tourists. I want to be very clear that we're not talking about metaphorical slavery. We're talking about human beings that are owned by other human beings and are coerced to work by the sheer force of violence. These boys are beaten by their masters if they do not comply. These men had their hands chopped off when they tried to run away from their traffickers. There is a steel padlock on the cell where this young woman is forced to sleep, and these slaves are held in a brick factory by the sheer force of terror. The brutality of slavery is real, and the face of those who administer the violence is also very real. But here's the even more extraordinary half of the story that I don't want us to miss. Not only is slavery more vast than ever, it's also more stoppable than ever. For the first time ever in human history, forces are aligning while we are alive to make it possible for this generation to see the end of slavery as a force in human affairs. Why is that? A couple of reasons. First, for the first time in history, slavery is against the law everywhere. But then why so many millions of slaves? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. Slavery exists on a massive scale in our world today because there are huge swaths of our world where you simply do not get in trouble for enslaving a poor person. In other words, while there are laws against slavery in every country, there are many countries where these laws are simply not enforced at all. For instance, in South Asia, statistics now show that if you were to enslave a poor person, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to ever be convicted for that crime. This is what the world must understand about slavery. It exists on a vast scale in our world for really just one reason, and that reason is impunity. Now, to be clear, impunity is not the only reason slavery exists. It's the reason why it exists on a vast scale. For instance, slavery does exist in developed countries like the U.S., where laws are actually reasonably well enforced. And even here, we can and need to do even better on enforcement because slavery on any scale is unacceptable. But impunity is not the chief explanation for why tens of thousands are in slavery in our own country. It's a much more complicated phenomenon than that. But impunity is the reason why tens of millions are in slavery in our larger world. And while slavery exists in every country, to some extent it does, in every country you could find it, it has concentrated itself in a few countries where slave traffickers can just freely get away with it. In fact, 70% of the world's slaves are in just 10 countries. This leads to the final reason why slavery is more stoppable than ever. For the first time, we are learning how to measure it, and we have found the vaccine that stops it. And here's what we've learned. When effective law enforcement is combined with excellent services for survivors, slavery rates fall dramatically. And at IJM, we've now had a few opportunities to actually demonstrate this. Our first project was with the Gates Foundation, where the goal was to measurably reduce sex trafficking of children in a mega city in the Philippines by 20% in 4 short years by standing up local law enforcement's capacity to actually address the problem. But when the results of our project came back in a study, we found that sex trafficking of kids had actually collapsed by 79%. And then we attacked the problem in 2 more major cities in the Philippines, and sex slavery of children fell by 77% and 86%. It turns out that the slave owners are not brave people. And if they think they're going to get caught and sent to jail, they just stop doing it. So, for the first time in the long story of mankind, there is a generation alive on the planet that is capable of seeing slavery truly swept into the dustbin of history. And for a moment, let's just step back and consider how extraordinary this is for you and for me. Think about how ancient slavery is. It has plagued human affairs for all of human history. For thousands and thousands of years, human beings have always known slavery. And consider how iconic this evil is for us. Thousands of years ago, when God wanted to demonstrate his character of love and justice to the world, he chose to tell a story of rescuing a people from slavery. The story of human slavery is as old as any human story. But if we stand back, we can actually see that this story has a definite arc to it and 4 reoccurring players. The story always begins, of course, with the slave and the slave owner. But in divine history, these relationships never exist in isolation. There are always 2 other players who are present: the governing authorities and the prophets of God. From the dawn of human history, God has used governing authorities as his instruments for restraining evil in human societies. At various times, the governing authorities are called judges or kings or magistrates or rulers or governors. And they can be godly, like King David or like King Hezekiah, or they can be perfectly pagan, like King Cyrus or King Artaxerxes or Caesar. But either way, when these governing authorities use their power to restrain evil, the Bible calls them God's ministers, his agents, or even his anointed. But when they fail to restrain evil and become complicit with evil, then the other key player is brought to the scene, and that is the godly prophet. It's the prophet's job to raise the alarm and call the governing authorities back to the service of good and away from evil. And this is true with slavery. In human history, slavery always exists or not by the will of the governing authorities. Notice when it is time to set the Hebrews free from slavery in Egypt, God sends his prophet Moses to Pharaoh, the governing authority, to set them free. Likewise, when Nehemiah found that the Hebrews themselves were selling their own desperate poor into slavery, Nehemiah says, I got very angry and brought charges against the nobles and the authorities, who then agreed to end slavery among the people. But such prophetic voices challenging the rulers against slavery were extremely rare in ancient times. And just about everywhere the governing authorities in the ancient world upheld slavery as a fundamental organizing principle of their societies. Through the Middle Ages, rulers did begin to limit slavery among their own people. But then they accelerated slavery as a reward for the conquest of other people. And by then, a young Christian church would give rise to a few godly prophets who challenged the governing authorities over the sin of slavery. But these prophets, like St. Gregory, or St. Chrysostom, or St. Patrick, St. Claver, or Bishop Bartolome, these were mostly prophets crying in the wilderness, and their voices changed little. And indeed, slavery thrived. As a global economy developed through the age of exploration in the 1500s, slavery became an engine of extraordinary economic advantage for the dominant trading nations of the world. So much so that by the late 17th century, slavery fueled an exploding industrial revolution in those nations. And by the 18th century, the most powerful global economy the world has ever seen found itself built on slavery. But then one of the most surprising things in history happened, utterly unprecedented in the story of human affairs. The most prosperous beneficiaries of this system of slavery were made to stop doing it for moral reasons. How did that happen? Well, historians tell us it happened because of 2 parallel transformations. A transformation in the governing authorities and a transformation in the prophets of God. Increasingly, in the 18th and 19th century, the great slave economies like those in the US, Britain, and France were not governed by emperors and kings, but by elected parliaments and presidents. At the same time, what the historians call the First and Second Great Awakenings transformed the prophets of God from a few isolated saints and theologians preaching and writing against slavery into the world's first mass movement of Christian abolition. A movement in which everyday Christians took up the cause of ending slavery on a mass scale. And with prophetic watchmen like William Wilberforce in Great Britain, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, with them sounding the alarm, the sleeping giant of the church woke up by the millions to call their ruling authorities to account for the sin of slavery. God gave common, everyday, church-going Christians the dignity of responsibility. And by the millions, they took up their prophetic call and addressed themselves to their now elected governing authorities and demanded an end to slavery. And over a generation, they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. They outlawed slavery from the most prosperous slave empires in history. The end of slavery seemed to have come, and the church, the godly prophets, the watchmen of God, by the millions, went back to sleep. But slavery did not, in fact, go away. Slavery evaded extinction by adaptation. It took on forms that old laws did not address, and it amassed in places where laws were not enforced. And as human population exploded in the 20th century, there were so many vulnerable people living in countries and communities where laws were not enforced that we find ourselves where we are right now. With almost 46 million people in slavery, more people in slavery today than any other time in human history. But why? Well, because the governing authorities are simply not doing their job. And in response, in the arc of history, what does God do? He raises up the prophetic voice of his people. He gives them the dignity of responsibility. God sends them to the pharaohs, to the kings, to the parliaments, to the presidents of the earth, and demands that they use their God-given power to let the oppressed go free. And it would seem, perhaps in regard to slavery, the God of history is preparing to do this for the last time. But the people of God cannot raise their prophetic voice if they are themselves asleep. And so we believe in this singular moment of history, it is time to awake the slumbering church, the slumbering giant of a church again. In recent years, there have been rumblings in our church pews and ministry conferences about slavery, and we're hearing more about human trafficking. But on the whole, the vast people of God have not reawakened from their 19th century slumber. And they simply do not passionately understand two things: that there are more slaves now than ever, and secondly, that God is making it possible for the first time in history to end slavery for good. And so as you rejoin whatever corner of the church you may know and love, I would just ask for your help to help do what you are perhaps uniquely placed to do. And that is to simply, lovingly wake up your own church to the prophetic call. Of course, this is all the more fun and powerful if we do it all together. And if we do it on a day and a place where sometimes Christians are the sleepiest, like Sunday, in church. And so we would invite you to go back and wake up every church you know and love to join God in his great moment of ending slavery. What we would ask is that you would simply start the conversation in your church about dedicating one Sunday to freedom. This year, churches all around the country will be doing this together on September 24th. And we'd love it if your church were to join the movement and if you were to be the one to help start the conversation about whether you would want to do that. Now, the church is a giant, and it's asleep, and so this won't be easy. But what I know is this, is that millions of everyday Christians have done this before, in other eras. And so as an encouragement to you at IJM, we have prepared some materials that are just simply available to any earnest Christian who wants to return to their church to start that conversation about a Freedom Sunday. And you actually have a flyer, I think, that might have been available to you as you came in or is available out of the table about how to be equipped with everything you need at your church to dedicate one Sunday to freedom. We are seeking to wake up the church with Freedom Sunday, and to do this in September, until the sleepiest day and the sleepiest place has become the most wide awake day and the most wide awake place, and that the people of God are out of bed. As long as there are millions of people for whom Christ died who are in slavery, there is going to be a Freedom Sunday. A Freedom Sunday until all are free. So the invitation is to join this growing movement of Christians and people of goodwill around the globe who are saying, enough is enough. And this is my challenge to you this afternoon, to concretely convey God's invitation to you, here, now, into the dignity of responsibility. To say that in this town, or whatever town you might call home, that we're going to take responsibility for making sure that our community knows two things: that there are more people in slavery than ever, and that God is making it possible for the first time in human history to end it for good. But God's invitation, of course, goes out beyond our own communities, because after we eradicate slavery in our own communities, what percentage of the problem will still exist in the rest of the world? 99%. So I'd like to also invite you to become a global freedom partner with IJM. There's a website here to which you could go and just sign up to be a freedom partner with IJM. We have now, by God's grace, become the largest international slavery organization in the world, anti-slavery organization. And we are attacking slavery in the corners of the world where it's most out of control. And by becoming a freedom partner, what you do is lend us what God has given to you to actually stop it. Lend us the power of your voice so we can raise awareness and so we together can change policy and move governments to act. Lend us the power of your prayer so we can call to bear the power of God to intervene and protect us as we take on the violence of slavery. And to lend us the power of your resources to actually pay for the hands-on rescue that the poor themselves cannot afford. You know, when I think of little Shama enslaved in a cigarette factory, or those little boys being sold to the pedophile, those little girls being sold to pedophiles in Southeast Asia, or these boys enslaved on a lake in Africa, I wonder, really, how are they somehow supposed to find it believable today that God loves them? How's that supposed to seem believable to them? What is God's plan for making that believable to them? And then I realize, oh, God has given us that responsibility. And He has given us the great dignity of that responsibility. And just as my Uncle Chuck was part of what they came to call the greatest generation that survived the Great Depression, that defeated global totalitarianism, that built so much of the peace and prosperity that we have really come to enjoy. Likewise, maybe God is inviting you and me to be part of a justice generation. Those who take responsibility for going to work with Him in the world to finally end slavery and to keep fighting until all are free. Over 160 years ago, Frederick Douglass preached a sermon on the 4th of July. And he said, "Let the people of God array their immense powers against slavery and slaveholding, and the whole system of crime and blood would be scattered to the winds." That day did not fully come for Frederick Douglass in his day. But by the grace of God, for the first time in history, it may come in ours. But until it does, we're just not going away until all are free. Thank you very, very much.
We are slavery's end. Each morning we rise, wide awake and filled with purpose. We fight fearlessly in the name of justice because we believe in a better world and a God who moves us to make it so. We are the church. Beyond a building or a day of the week, relentlessly defending freedom. Not for some distant future, but for today. So that this may be the last generation to be owned, sold, or ignored in their suffering. And though we may be free, we are tied to those still held in bondage. And we will not go away until lives, communities, and nations are transformed. Until all countries protect all of their citizens. So, each day we rise again, knowing we are slavery's end. And we will never be free. Until all are free.
All right, well, thank you, Gary. My name is Rick Truer. I'm from the Advancement Division here at Calvin College. If you have a question that was written on a card that you'd like to get to Gary, please hold it up and ushers will collect them and bring them forward. I want to get started with, we've had a lot of questions emailed in, several about kind of wanting to follow up on the study you did with the Gates Foundation in the Philippines. One, wondering, with the reduced numbers in slavery, how reliable do you know those numbers are, considering that so much of it's in the underground market? And also, what follow-up have you done in the past several years, and has that reduction in slavery, those numbers held?
Yeah, great questions. Because this has been the great challenge. If you're going to begin to address slavery and reduce it, you'd have to understand how much there is, and whether or not what you're doing actually is lowering the amount of slavery. And so this is what we've been pioneering over the last number of years with experts in this field of monitoring and evaluation. And so we developed these tools and capacities now to actually map out in sex trafficking, for instance, in this one particular city, hundreds of all of the commercial sex establishments and places where kids are being sold. And then there's a very difficult process of enumeration where for weeks and weeks and weeks they just use a basket of indicators to figure out what is the number of children that are being held illegally in the commercial sex industry. So now that study that we did in the city of Cebu with the Gates Foundation, that actually was done by outside auditors from IJM and also was then validated by third-party folks. So we actually do have now validated studies of these numbers. And we've been able to replicate that in two other Filipino cities and in Cambodia as well. And we're starting in other parts of the world to measure this in regard to child sexual assault, widows and orphans being thrown off their land, forced labor, slavery. We will need to continually improve these methodologies, but what we can't say is that this can't be measured. What we can't say is that we're unwilling to keep improving these measurements so that we can actually see whether or not the various interventions that are brought to bear against slavery actually work.
So following up a little bit more on that, wondering about the last 20% or so that are still enslaved. Is there something that makes it more difficult to overcome that last hurdle?
Yeah, there's just the difference between soft crime and hard crime. Most of the crime that happens against the poorest and most vulnerable in our world is soft crime. It's purely crime of opportunity, and it's highly elastic to risk. That is to say, as soon as there starts to become a significant amount of risk that you could get in trouble for that crime, people stop doing it. So you find at the first stages, much of this crime against the poor falls very, very quickly, and then you're stuck with the more determined criminals or the crimes of desperation that take place. But the vast majority of crime against the poor, and specifically slavery, which is a highly discretionary economic crime, people do it because they're trying to make money. And what we've seen is that as soon as they figure out, oh, we'll actually go to jail for this, then they stop doing it. Because all of these are businesses that can be run profitably in most circumstances with a paid labor force. But if you're given the option to do it with slave labor, you do. So sex trafficking is a specific commercial sex industry, which what we've seen is the commercial sex industry itself does not necessarily go away, but they get the children out of the pool because that's illegal. The slaves were held in brick factories and rice mills and fishing industry and agriculture. All those things can continue, but the choice is, do I do it with a paid labor force or do I do it with a slave labor force? And as long as the law enforcement authorities allow me to use a slave labor force, I will. But as soon as I start to sense I'll get in trouble, I quickly get out of that business. And that's the soft crime that disappears amazingly quickly.
All right, thank you. This question came in on Twitter, wondering why there isn't a higher level of awareness to modern day slavery.
I think, number one, because it victimizes the most marginalized people in the world. So they are the people who have the weakest voices, have the least political power, least economic power. So they are the people on the margins, people whom you can hurt and abuse without anyone paying much attention. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that they are working in industries which are also conducted on a legitimate basis. So you could drive by a brick factory in Southeast Asia, and from the outside, if you drive casually by, you can't tell from the outside who is in that facility because they are being held there under the threat that if they leave, they're going to be abused or their families are going to be hurt, versus the factory that you drive past where people are working just on the basis of the wage. So I think those are the two primary reasons why this stays below the radar for the most part, is that the victims are the most marginalized, and it's also hard to visually see.
All right. That ties into another question that someone else had emailed in, wondering how you can identify somebody who may be in slavery.
It's really hard. And we've had to develop these capacities now to do enumeration. At the beginning, we did it through criminal investigative efforts. You infiltrate these enterprises on some basis of a ruse, and then you begin to develop relationships and have conversations with the people who are held in slavery, and you understand their circumstances. And that's a technical criminal investigation. But if you're going to begin to enumerate it on a larger basis, this is required. What we're learning now is a community-based capacity to infiltrate in ways that are unnoticed these sites where the common poor are being abused. And It's sometimes a matter of technical criminal undercover investigation. In other places, it's a way of where societies are so stratified by language or culture or community that if you actually send in someone that is from that strata, they can come and go and get the information quite freely.
All right, thank you. This is a question from the audience here. This person
These
says,
are actually, I would say, hugely complicated things to explain, but I'm trying to give you a flavor for it in a short answer. But for all the people who know a tremendous amount about this on my team or in the audience, I know these answers are inadequate. So,
thank you for the clarification. This person writes, I live in South Asia. We hesitate to get the police force involved as it is expected that bribes will need to be paid and power will be misused in combating injustice.
Right.
You mentioned that the success in the Philippines involved an effective police force. How would you achieve that effectiveness of that force? And in by far most of the countries, there is no church to call to action.
Great questions. Yes, one of the primary problems with slavery is the complicity of law enforcement. They're actually being paid to protect it. There's a number of ways that this can be addressed. One of the most powerful ways is by establishing a relatively small, specialized, vetted unit that is not corrupt. And it can effectively destroy the corruption mechanism in the following way. If you think about it, if you're a criminal trying to get away with something like running a brick factory with slaves or a brothel with children, you are paying bribes to the local police not for a reduced probability you're going to get in trouble, but for the certainty of not getting in trouble. I'm going to pay you this bribe and I'm going to be totally safe, right? Now, what happens if you have a single unit of police who are not corrupt, who won't take those bribes, and who are just going around in an almost rogue sense and actually enforcing the law? Now, I don't actually have an effective a bribe that's actually effective, because I pay these police officers, but they can't guarantee me this unit of untouchables won't actually send me to jail. So you don't actually have to clean up the entire police force, but you do have to have the commitment of the top leadership to establish a trained and vetted unit, specialized unit that will enforce the law. And this is what happened in the Philippines, is there was a commitment at the senior level to establish these specialized units, make sure that they are not corrupt, and they decimate the corruption system. It happens much faster than you might imagine because you don't have to clean up all the police, but you do have to have a center that has integrity.
All right, thank you. I've gotten several questions regarding mass incarceration, and this question from Twitter says, the book, The New Jim Crow, argues that American slavery is transformed in the prisons, this industrial system, and how would you respond to this?
Yeah, well, this is a serious problem in the United States. The incarceration levels in our own communities, especially in minority communities. It's also first worth just recovering a bit of history that you had the almost systematic re-enslavement of African Americans in the South after the Civil War through convict leasing and through peonage and other systems that used the designation of someone as a criminal as then a way to be able to just use them for forced labor. And in fact, in the South, the state and county governments made money by leasing those prisoners to large businesses. And so who would then pay the local government. So the local government had an actual financial incentive to accuse black citizens of committing crimes, things like vagrancy, walking on the railroad tracks, selling cotton after dark. And then once that was designation as a criminal was placed upon them, they would be enslaved for the rest of their lives. This was what happened for 50 years after the Civil War. There's a marvelous book called Slavery by Another Name that's worth recovering. But likewise, in our era, if you use the power of designating someone as a criminal that you can deprive them such that you can deprive them of their freedom, and you are not monitoring whether or not that is done very, very rigorously, and especially on behalf of those who are poor, who can't afford excellent legal services, you are down a track where you're going to be victimizing a lot of people on a massive basis, and I think that's a challenge that's right in front of our own community.
I'm getting a lot of questions from folks both here and at remote sites, and college students, other people wondering how they can get involved, what work they can do beyond just alerting their church.
Yes.
What happens, what can they do after that?
Yes.
And also, what would you say to a college student who might want to do this for life work?
Yeah. Well, please just visit our website at ijm.org, which has a whole set of ways to be engaged. Also to say that this struggle requires all kinds of gifts and talents. So yes, the legal field is important and the criminal investigative field, but also social work and trauma care for those who are survivors of this abuse is absolutely indispensable, because if the survivors of this kind of abuse and trauma do not get excellent care, not just sort of check the box care, but excellent care, the odds of them being re-exploited or taken back into slavery are very high. But if they get excellent aftercare, the odds of them ever being re-trafficked are actually very small. And we now have the volume of data to show that this is the case. But it also means that it implicates fields also of communication, of journalism, telling the story of this, and all just the skills and gifts of running an excellent enterprise or effort. So I would encourage everybody who's interested to visit our website and look for ways to engage with us. For college students interested in this field, a couple of things I would say for sure is I would explore whatever opportunities you can to actually somehow draw close to actual human beings who are survivors and victims of these abuses. For this to remain simply an abstraction or something that you read about and study, as important as that is, almost everything that one learns that ends up being important about trying to address the problem comes from being close to the actual human beings who endure it and suffer it. And so finding ways over time to patiently engage the work, understand it as a human problem, and then figure out what part of this problem am I most passionate about. Is it telling the story of it? Is it doing the investigation of it? Is it a policy matter? Is it paying for it? Whatever it is. And then I'm going to find my place in the fight and become the best in the world at actually doing that part of the fight with great excellence. That's what I'd do.
All right. Just a few things. You mentioned about getting to know some of the victims maybe on a more personal level, that type of thing. I've had several questions wondering what has happened to those whom IJM has freed.
Yeah.
Wondering specifically about the woman that you showed on screen rolling cigarettes.
Yeah.
Have you kept in contact with them, and what's happened to them?
Yeah. So this is a point that I was making briefly, is that if you don't provide long-term excellent services to survivors, much of the benefit of the rescue efforts is lost. And so IJM is actually committed over many, many years to providing these long-term aftercare services. We actually have protocols for actually measuring whether those things actually succeed and at what kind of rates. And our rates tend to be in the high upper 80s and 90% of what we call effective restoration. So it's absolutely critical and something that we hold ourselves accountable and responsible for by name for each one of the people that are brought out of slavery. We work with partners almost always in doing this. So we work with other excellent agencies and ministries that provide care and assistance, but we hold ourselves accountable over years as to how that does or does not measurably succeed. But this is an indispensable part of what it is that we do. Those little kids that I saw in the back room of that brothel about 15 years ago, I've had occasional opportunities to go back and see them over the years, and it's an extraordinary thing to see them actually grow up, become mature young adults now who look me in the eye. They really have no idea who I am because it happened a long, long time ago. But to see the restoration and the joy and the love in their eyes is an amazing thing.
Yeah. Following up on that, we had a question regarding those children and children like that. How are they actually brought into slavery? Do their parents give them up? And what are the circumstances that allow them to end up in that situation?
Lots of different stories. Most of them are a story of a young person who is told a story that if they come with this person, that they'll get a better job in another city. A trafficker always wants to displace someone from their community and hopefully even from their state or in their country and take them to a place where they'll be far away from social supports, where they won't know the language, where they won't know who to turn to, where they'll feel lost, because it's easy to control someone in that environment. That's oftentimes why they call this trafficking in some way, because you're moving human beings. But the reason the traffickers move them is because people are easier to then control. But I don't want to have to drag someone kicking and screaming to this other city or to this other country. So what I do is I give them a lie that they can believe. And these are elaborate and patiently developed ruses or stories. So that kid is actually running with me to this other place because they are believing that there's a job or a school opportunity. So almost always it is the case that they use the ruse of economic desperation. Use the circumstance of economic desperation to tell them a lie about a better life that is over here. And sometimes the parents will be completely oblivious. Sometimes they will be willing to sort of suspend their disbelief and hope that that's true, what the people are saying. And sometimes they're actually complicit. So there are circumstances too where people will sell their children in these transactions and not even out of desperation will do it for a better refrigerator or something. And those things are very difficult things to understand. But for the most part, it is situations where the desperate poor are taking a risk that this might be a true story, and they send their family member with someone who then betrays them.
I've had several questions from folks wondering about the extent of slavery in the U.S. and also people who've heard things about sex trafficking being increased in cities where there's large sporting events going on, such as the Super Bowl or the Olympics. And just wondering how much slavery there is in the U.S., and is that also happening around those types of events?
Yeah, so the estimates are that there's tens of thousands of people who are held in various forms of slavery in the United States. A lot of them are held in the commercial sex trade, and this takes place in a lot of environments where you might just pass by. It's the strip club or the massage parlor or the bar where there are vulnerable teenagers or undocumented people or others who are separated from social supports and they're being exploited in sex trafficking. They're also been found to be held in conditions of forced labor in agricultural facilities and in sweatshops. And the important thing here is that local communities just make clear to local law enforcement that this is a priority for them to proactively investigate. Because it won't be the thing that they hear about because it's obvious on the street or that it's taking place in the community that has the greatest sort of voice to raise the alarm. It's going to be in the secret, hidden, marginalized sectors of our community. And law enforcement needs to be encouraged by the rest of us to make sure that they proactively investigate leads and make sure that we are staying accessible and open to organizations and community leaders who are serving in those communities so that they feel free to provide leads to law enforcement.
All right. And finally, what gives you hope in the work that you're doing with IJM?
the thing that gives me hope in the work of IJM is I think there's a God of justice. That the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice because the creator of the universe is a God of justice. And so that is what gives me hope. I've also just seen such faithfulness of God working through his people over the years that I've actually seen enough miracles myself. I'm convinced. And God is still in the business of doing justice, and it's a hard and costly work, but he wants to give us the dignity of responsibility in it. And so that's my great hope.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gary, for being with us.